My name is Thomas Pedersen. I'm an osteopath and yoga teacher, and this is a quick introduction to my video that comes straight after this, which is my take on some functional anatomy of the spine. So we're not going to go into details, you're not going to be obsessing about names of this, that, whatever. It's more about looking at the function, the things I've gleaned over the years from the anatomy of the spine. How does that govern function? What impact does certain anatomical features have on the way we practice yoga, or even move in our day-to-day life? So hopefully you find it interesting. If you haven't already subscribed to my channel, please do so. It really does help. And if you've got any questions, just ask. Write in the comments below, and I'll try and see if I can answer them. Thank you for watching, and let's get on with it. Hi, my name is Thomas Pedersen, and this is just my quick little take on some basic spinal anatomy. I'm using this model here, which I must admit is not the best, but hopefully it will illustrate the points I'm trying to make. So we've got the spine here lying down, we've got the vertebrae here, we've got the discs here. Now, the vertebrae and the discs are fairly consistent throughout the whole spine. So things that change are basically the height of the vertebrae and the size of the discs. So the vertebrae there to stabilise, the disc there to resolve. So as we go up through the spine, we'll notice that gradually the vertebrae get smaller. And we're moving our way up through in towards the neck. And actually in the neck, towards the top of the neck, the vertebrae are really small. The discs are really small. Now the obvious reason for that is obviously weight bearing. So the further down you get the spine, the more weight is above it, the more load these discs and vertebrae have to cope with. So normally about 80% of the weight or the load goes through the vertebral bodies, which are the back bits here, so to this arch here and the discs, and the rest go through the front bit. Now, the relevance of that partly is, certainly with certain yoga postures for instance, is if we are upside down, we mustn't allow the head to take the load, because you can see the size of these vertebrae, they're tiny compared to the ones in the lumbar spine. So there's a huge difference, in the kind of their ability to cope with load. So going on from that, we then have the pelvis, we have the nominates, we have the SI joint here, not brilliantly displayed on this model, but it is there, and we've got the hip joints. Now, one interesting thing I'm just going to mention with the hip joint is a lot of people talk about the labrum problems now, which are becoming much more problematic, or much more prevalent is the word, and especially, in fact, actually in yoga. And one of the reasons for that is that we've got this labrum, which is a cartilage ring that goes around the edge of the joint, basically to deepen and stabilise the joint a little bit more. And the problem with that is that if you have excess movement in the hip joint, you can then really pinch in against that. Like I say, this model is not brilliant for that, but you can really jam in there, like deep lunges, really up the front here, digging into the front of the labrum as you come round. So that is a common issue nowadays, and I think it's can be quite a common hip injury in yoga, definitely. So, symphysis pubis, front, there's a little disc in there, and then if we turn the model over, we've got the sacrum. Got all the yellow bits coming out of the spine, which are the nerves. We've got the coccyx, which is a fused vertebrae at the top, at the bottom. Generally not a huge problem in yoga. More problems I see is from kind of falls and landing on them. The SI joints, again very unhelpfully here, they're screwed together, but in life there's movement, it's a fibrous joint, it's a massive joint. So there's a huge amount of scope for movement in there. Not a lot of movement, but it does move. And you can get uneven movement from one side to the other. And again, with yoga, because of this persistent practice over years, sometimes they can get quite loose, which then affects the surrounding musculature, your piriformis, your psoas muscles, things like that, which is kind of beyond the scope of this video, but it's something to keep in mind. The main point I wanted to discuss really today was the vertebrae and the anatomy of the vertebrae and how that governs function, which is a very osteopathic concept. Structure governs function. So we look at the structure, we decide what it's good at, and then we look at what we do in the day-to-day to see if that's actually useful or whether we're putting stress on it. And I think we can apply the same principles to yoga. So as we look at the lumbar spine, we'll notice we've got these spinous processes, they're massive. And that's because there's lots of things attaching to that thoracolumbar fascia, ligaments, all sorts. It's hugely stable, it's hugely strong, and it's there to stabilize, you know, the lumbar spine. Now, the point with the joints is that if we look at the joints, they're generally facing roughly this direction, so roughly down, not completely, but just as a rough guide, face down. Now, what that means is that they're quite restricted in rotation, as a rule. Now, again, we bear in mind here, we haven't got any structures, other structures like muscles, ligaments, etc. So there's going to be more movement here than there will be in life. So roughly in the lumbar spine, it's 1 degree rotation per vertebrae. 1 degree, it's not a lot. So bear that in mind when you do all your spinal twists and things like that. So what about the other vectors? Well, side bending, there's going to be some, but again there's going to be quite a potential for jamming into these joints without going too far into side bending. So looking at that, that can be, without us having to side bend too far, we can get some compression there. Then flexion extension. Well, extension, similar principle. Extend far enough and you're going to jam the joints together. The biggest issue, if in many ways, is not that, because all those vectors are governed or limited by what you might call an anatomical barrier, which is a bony barrier. You're not going to get beyond it unless you damage the spine, like in an accident or something like that, or wear and tear potentially. The biggest issue is flexion, because in flexion there's no anatomical barrier, no bony barrier, and we can flex away. Now that's one of the reasons why we've got these massive spinous processes, because they're there to really try and stop us flexing too much, to try and retain the curve in the lower back, which is the kind of healthy position to be in. But because we sit so much slumped over desks and sofas and etc., over time these ligaments get lax, they get loose, you get what's called creep, which is they gradually lengthen under load, and as a result of that we tend to get more laxity and potential hypermobility there, and that has a big impact on the discs as well. So if we go back to what we talked about before, in a normal lumbar curve, we've got 80% of the weight going through the vertebral bodies and the discs, even pressure down through them. As we flex, we're going to actually shift the weight forwards, which means that more weight, more pressure is going backwards. So more weight is going forwards, but the pressure going backwards. So it's like a balloon. You squeeze the front of the balloon, it's going to bulge at the back. Now this is basically what happens with discs. As we lose the lumbar lordosis, the discs bulge at the back. Now for years that's fine, they'll cope with that, they're extremely strong and very good at resilient to kind of this kind of stress. But on top of that, we then start to rotate a lot. Now the way the fibers at the back of the disc are aligned is that they're cross-hatched in a kind of pattern like this. So as we flex, you know, and rotate, some of the layers are going to soften and slack, and the other ones are not going to respond that well. So over time, what tends to happen is they get slack, they start to tear a little bit, you might get some gaps developing in between, and lo and behold, maybe we get a little bit of a bulge coming out. So flexion rotation typically is the way to bulge a disc. Now they tend to bulge laterally or posterior laterally, like here, because that's often the weakness point. Unfortunately, that's also where the nerve travels, so that's often why we get these sciatica symptoms where we're getting pain down the leg. So excess flexion, sustained excess flexion with lots of rotation is a good way to irritate your discs and actually weaken them over time. It doesn't happen overnight, it's years, but it does happen. So just to summarize that, bony end range in 3 of the vectors essentially, no end range or no bony restriction in flexion. And that's one of the reasons why we get problems with that. As we move up the spine, we come into what's called the Junction Area. So we've got 4 of those. We've got the sacrum to the lumbar spine, we've got the lumbar spine to the thoracic spine to cervical, cervical to the base of the skull. Now the most important or the most significant, I think, is this one here. So we've got 5 lumbar vertebrae, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We've got 12 thoracic vertebrae. Now as we move into the thoracic spines, not always, you know, the junction area can be a little bit different, but the point is in the lumbar spine we've got these joints facing this way. In the thoracic spine, the joints roughly face this direction. So what tends to happen is we end up with a vertebrae that at the bottom has got the lumbar joints, and at the top of the same vertebrae has got the thoracic joints. So there's going to be a lot of bone stress going through this section here, which is why sometimes doesn't move as well, or we get this kind of perceived restriction in rotation, or side bending, whatever, either in yoga postures or certainly in clinics as well sometimes. And if we forget about this junctional area, we might think, oh, we need to free that up. Well, maybe not, because it's just not actually meant to move that much. The thoracic spine joints, like I said, roughly facing this way. We've got a kyphosis, so we've got a curve the opposite way to the lumbar spine. And in theory, there's a lot of rotation here. The thing we haven't got on this model is the rib cage. Now, the rib cage is there to really, protect the organs, protect the lungs, the heart, etc. It's there as a cage. It stabilizes, it protects. And as a result of that, it's going to impact the movement of the thoracic spine, which is often the stiffest part of the back. So even though it looks like there's a lot of movement here, there isn't a huge amount in the kind of typical thoracic spine and rib cage. Now, this is one area where yoga can massively benefit, because we can hugely increase that range of movement through regular mobilizing. Because the ribs do move, the spine does move, and it's just being limited by this kind of stiffness that develops. So again, we've got some rotation. We look at the other vectors. Extension, if we really extend, again, we're going to jam. We're going to hit a bony barrier, which is going to be uncomfortable. So again, thinking about that, when we overextend, we obsess about extending the spine, over balls, whatever, it can be useful, but it can definitely also cause a problem if you overdo it, because you're really going to irritate all these structures. Side bending, potential for a lot of side bending, but again, the ribs are going to restrict that movement because of the way they kind of line up. Flexion, quite a lot there. So again, there's some restriction in the thoracic spine and the rib cage, but flexion, slumping, which is such a common position to get into. Actually, because of the way the ribs are, there's not a lot of rib stability around the front. It's mainly the side and the back. And actually, the front, the sternum, yes, it's there, but below the sternum, there's nothing. So there's quite a lot of potential for slumping without hitting any barriers. As a result of that, we load these back tissues, the muscles, the ligaments, etc. Similar scenario to the low back, we can get creep, we can get postural pain in the muscles, they get tired, and over time, we get a lot of aches and pains. Saying that, the actual vertebrae, discs, nerves, etc., in the middle back are not that prone to getting injured. It happens, but it's not often that you get a thoracic disc, for instance. So it can cope with it, but it can create a lot of pain, not through kind of bony pain, but through muscular fatigue, ischemia, all these other things. So as you move up, coming towards the neck. Again here, there's going to be a junctional area somewhere, which is not going to be as dramatic as the other ones, but again in the cervicals we've got 7 vertebrae, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So here we've got T1. So there's going to be some difference, the kind of mobility here. Now, the neck joints, if you can see, so thoracics might be there facing that direction. The neck joints are more kind of, not as steep, so to speak. They're more flat in a way. So again, there's quite a lot of potential for movement there in most vectors, side bending, going from side to side. Extension, again, we're going to get a bony barrier limit there. Rotation is interesting because rotation in the lower 5 vertebrae is not huge. The upper 2 vertebrae is a huge potential for rotation, which is not noticeable on this model, but in life it's definitely there. And the reason for that, and this model is just not going to show it, but on the top vertebrae in here, we've got what's called the odontoid pec. So we just pull that out of the way, you might be able to see that in there, that pec there, that's sticking up. So that vertebrae is pivoting around that peg, basically, and then the base of the skull. So 50% of the rotation happens between those 2 vertebrae towards the top of the skull. So a real discrepancy there, and that's really worth remembering. So going back to the size of the vertebrae again, they're quite small. We've got some ligaments, we've got lots of muscles attaching into these ridges in the back of the head, going down into the neck and shoulders. Really significant from a posture point of view. We've got lordosis, again, a curve. So we've got these 3 curves. We've got lordosis, kyphosis, lordosis. So, excuse me. All of this comes together to create a really nice structure, a really strong structure, and a very flexible structure. But one of the things we need to look at is, well, why have we got these curves? Well, partly because of shoulder absorption. So as we're in our normal curves, So just going to accentuate the light slightly. As we walk around life, we're going to be, doing little bits like that. There's going to be a lot of give in the system, a lot of bounce in the system. If we straighten the spine completely, which it's not unusual nowadays actually, because of the amount of slumping we do. We lose the lumbar curve, the upper back, middle back might curve forward, but the bottom line is there's very little cushioning there. And where does the load go? Goes into the discs. It creates more problems there over time. More bulging discs, more back pain. So I think all of those things taken together just gives you an indication or just a quick overview of the spine as I see it, without going into detail about the names and the structures, etc. I think that's unimportant really for this lecture. It's more about the alignments, the facing of these joints, the size of the vertebrae, the SI joints. And one thing we haven't mentioned is the ischial tuberosities, the sitting bones as we often refer to them in yoga. The hamstrings attach from here and go down the back of the leg. So we all know, well, I do certainly know people who've had problems with the hamstrings through yoga. So again, pivoting, bending, in an effort over time, we've really learnt the lesson largely about not over-flexing the spine. The problem is we now then pivot to the hip completely, creating a tremendous stress on the hamstring insertion, and we get what's called proximal hamstring tendinopathy, which is really chronic and it's a yoga and a long distance runner's injury, to be honest. So it's all about balancing these things up, but that's for a discussion another time. So hopefully this has been useful. If you haven't done it already, please subscribe to my channel, like this video and share it about. It really helps. If you've got any questions, just ask in the comments below and I'll try and answer them. Thank you for watching.